live stream, but there's actually a lot of things to talk about here, especially with the news coverage all over Ukraine and with the situation that's going on with these protests, and of course people in Ukraine who are also fighting to defend their country from any foreign aggression. I don't know where to begin here, but you know what I'm seeing right now online, especially when it comes to people on the left, especially I too am on the left, but you know, the situation in Russia is kind of complicated. And I know there are all sides to the story of what's going on in Ukraine, especially, of course, there are fascists, right wingers who are, bullying the country, as well as there are people on the left or people who are in the center who are also, getting loud in Ukrainian geopolitics. But what I'm seeing right now is that, like, of course, the thing is, of course, there's a lot of misinformation out there about what's going on. And I'm not calling out all of the people on the left, but I'm calling out those who are so-called leftist or the pseudo left who kind of act so anti-imperialist or so, against imperialism, but they have no problem supporting an imperialist power. And let me remind you that, like, regardless of information you hear about Putin, whether good or bad, you can never underestimate him. You can never underestimate the trolls he has online because, Putin was a KGB agent and he knows how to spread disinformation and he knows how to distort them and make it as a propaganda. While I think it might be true that there are people on the right in Ukraine who are trying to sabotage peace talks with Russia and, of course, in the central government in Ukraine. But you just don't know, in spite that it could be the US that might have, influence with the fascists in Ukraine. But who knows? Maybe Putin himself has surrounded himself with fascists all over Europe. He has supported fascists in Eastern Europe. He has supported, trying to split Europe and divide them within the whole continent, especially within the European Union. No doubt about that. And it's no doubt that the US might be playing a role too. Especially while I think also that this Russia meddling in the US election was all crap. But you cannot dismiss the fact that it could have been true that Russia played a role. Especially Trump kept bragging or keep teasing the Russians to go hack into the emails of Hillary or it's no surprise that they might have hacked within the email of the Democrats. But even though that there are Democrats who I don't like, even though that I'm a registered Democrat, I vote Democrat. But being with the Democratic Party is just like, a strategic advantage to it, especially if you're a liberal or on the left. While, you know, to get to the point, is that, like, while Putin himself, no doubt that he has influenced right wing, ultra conservative, fascist, racist, Nazi candidates in all across Europe. And he's very good in trying to twist, and he knows how to smear the minds of the public. Oh, that it could be the CIA, or it could be the US, or the US liberals that are supporting these fascists in Europe. Well, it could be true. Who knows? If there is real information out there that, you know, the the US government is, supporting this, fascist movements in across Europe, it'll be no surprise. But you got to also look at the fact that maybe Putin himself, he has, funded this fascist Nazis in Europe. And he has clearly used any justifications or smear propagandas of Nazism and anti Semitism to invade other countries. That has always been the talking point, especially in Europe, or especially when the US invaded Iraq over this weapons of mass destruction thing. But here's what I am not liking right now, what I'm seeing online, especially to people on the left who are quite silent with the invasion, who are clearly building a constructive justification of Russia rolling in tanks into Ukraine, or those saying that, oh, it's not a repeat of Nazism invading Europe, or Stalin invading. We should not dismiss the fact too that NATO and the US could actually be playing a worse role in aggression in Ukraine, like how the worst aggressions that they did in Eastern Europe with the Yugoslav Civil War. No doubt about that. There's no doubt, or we can talk about how the US is supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia to drop bombs and starve children in Yemen, or drone striking in East Africa and even parts of the Middle East. There's no doubt that, like, the disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan, or the peace withdrawals, the winners in the Afghanistan war was the US with, the defense contractors. No doubt about that. No doubt that the defense contractors and people in the military industrial complex were playing a vigorous role or vicious role in extending the war to 20 years instead of, you know, trying to use trying to use peace as a weapon or to ease down tensions between the Taliban, the US backed Afghan government, and the US. And it's no doubt, while I've always been very supportive, and I've always of people on the left who are very outspoken, and I've also been very outspoken of the unfair US foreign policy in Latin America, especially in Central America with, their instability, and those in socialist countries like Bolivia, Venezuela, and Cuba. And these are countries that have a very stable, have one of the best education systems in the world, and the best economic social welfare system in the world, and the best one of the best healthcare systems and best health professions is in Cuba. where Cuban doctors were being sent to all over the world during the coronavirus outbreak. I used to believe this thing that, you know, that Cuba was like this dictatorship that's starving its people. But then as soon as I started realizing what, you know, the kind of healthcare system that they have in Cuba, especially doctors go around the cities, houses around the country to check up with, patients who are might be in need of health. And after I saw footages there, it changed my mind that, like, you know what? There's something wrong here with the US narrative of, you know, towards Cuba. And Bolivia also too has one of the best social systems there with their labor system. No doubt about that. But it shouldn't give the excuse of what another imperialist power like Russia is doing towards its western borders. It should not give the excuse to the fact that, like, obviously Putin himself wants to revive an all new Russian empire under his heels. But we cannot also ignore that the US has also tried to demonize other countries in the name of freedom to expand their military empire. You cannot also deny that, what China is doing is also another form of imperialism. And a lot of this information, a lot of these criticisms that I've been hearing about China in countries in Asia and Africa are coming from the leftist sector, who are very critical of China's unfair, balanced, unbalanced trade between EU, between Africa, China, Asia. While of course the US will build a military base as a bargain to countries that want to be under the heel of US interests, corporate interests. China, of course, itself is a state-run corporation. And because China is not involved in wars like the US, while the US has a very big military budget, China has a very huge budget for infrastructure. And they will keep building and building and building in other countries, build infrastructural projects in countries. And then later on, they're going to be in debt to China. They're going to have to pay China. And if those countries' Federal Reserve does not and central bank do not have enough money, China's basically going to colonize them. Probably not the kind of colonization like Europe did in Africa and parts of Asia, but they're going to colonize these countries. And, there might be another second decolonization. Well, I think other countries that, that are corrupt, I think need to decolonize themselves. But it shouldn't give China and Russia the excuse to enforce its imperialist power or to commit more crimes as imperialist regimes, because the US is always ignoring its own war crimes. And of course, the US keeps ignoring its own human rights abuses, domestic and abroad. But right now with the Ukraine, I think that both the US and Russia should stay away from Ukraine and let Ukraine have its own right to self-determination. And what I'm seeing right now is, if it was true that the West started this war, then I would believe it. If Putin himself, in Russia, ignited this war, I would believe it. But what really should not be the excuse is to be a pro-authoritarian, to be a pro-imperialist country because you impose another imperialist power. I have imposed the imperialist policies of the US, China, and Russia. For me, as a fellow leftist and as a fellow anti-imperialist. But what I'm seeing right now, especially with the so-called left, I'm very disgusted of what I am seeing. The fact that, like, you cannot, so there are anti-war protesters, or quote-unquote anti-war, who are going around and saying that U.S. war with Russia, don't stop the war with Russia on Ukraine, or U.S. hands off Ukraine. And I find this hypocritical because, so it singles out another imperialist power like Russia, while Russia could have been the one that started all this war, and you're giving the excuse that, as if like only the US or Western Europe started this war. And it is no doubt that these so-called anti-war protesters who are supporting the Russia invasion are also, and also to the people in Fox News, the pro-Trump, Trump himself, the right-wing media, had also supported this invasion. And basically, you people in the so-called anti-war have been very loud when Trump was the president, and then he was very aggressive in foreign policy, and you condemned him for it. But you're all together because Trump favored the Russian invasion. You are very complicit by saying that, oh, it's only the U.S. that always starts an invasion. Well, yeah, it could be true, but what if Russia was the one that started it? That's why I'm saying that you cannot underestimate Putin, because while it could be true that Putin is the one that's spreading all this false information, that a lot of this fascists in Ukraine are all funded by the US government. And then, of course, that Putin started all this war of false information through the media that led up to the ignitement of anarchy within Ukraine. And then, of course, that gave Russia the excuse to roll in tanks in Crimea in 2014. And even until this day, that's igniting the war. While I hear some defamatory comments from left-leaning sites, which I'm not going to drag names, but saying that, oh, the US started it in 2014 and now Russia's fighting back this year in 2022. While I find it hypocritical that, what if Russia was the one that started it first and then they did it again this year? That's the point. But what should be clear is that I think that a military alliance like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is very necessary, and a military alliance should be formed. but only with the conditions of the self determination of that country who wants to join that military alliance, not in any conditions of a global power. That's the one dictating all the terms. I don't think that NATO should be abolished as an anti-war myself. I think it should be used for security purposes with only the conditions that each country would have the right to, you know, take its terms and not by the conditions of a global dominant power. So before I wrap this up, is this meant to say that to those who are claimed to be on the left, but you know, you are only support you if you're so let me get this to this point. You can be if you want to be anti-imperialist, you will have to oppose or criticize the unfair policies of that global power, regardless of any country what it is, even if it is even two or three imperialist powers. But if you're very anti-imperialist, whatever country you criticize, but you're not very critical of that other imperialist power and claiming that's not an imperialist power, you're pro-imperialist yourself. You're just an imperialist favoring another imperialist power. So I am not so I'm not taking any position here or to sway you, but it's just to give you an analysis of what is defining imperialism or unnecessary aggression. So my anti-imperialist stance is I've been very, very, very critical of the very vicious US foreign policy towards Latin America. Especially, I think that the sanctions in Cuba, the embargo in Cuba, be eliminated. Because while it's true that Cuba does trade to other countries, it doesn't, as I agree, it doesn't work that way. The If a country that does business with the US and then does business in Cuba, their assets will be frozen if you start doing business in Cuba. And and they should stop hurting countries who have a better economic, educational, and healthcare system. And I think that if the US does not want to see a aggression of foreign policy like China and Russia, they need to learn how to get along with these countries, because if the US starts, bullying these countries, that will give China and Russia the excuse to walk in and, believing that China and Russia are the saviors from US imperialism, but not knowing that China and Russia are just another imperialist power, just like the US. So, I'm not liking what is going on with online, especially on Twitter, of people who are in the so-called left or so-called anti-imperialist that will go around silent of Russia's unnecessary aggression in Ukraine and justifying that it wasn't Putin that started it, but Putin's fighting back. or it shouldn't give the excuse that all Ukrainians are fascists and Putin is going to walk in tanks there to what he said denazify Ukraine, and which one journalist, centrist journalist, said is bullshit. So I've also supported the protests in Belarus and for the people and for Belarus' right to self-determination, because I would agree that Belarus needs a new leadership and a new system that, you know, no longer under the heel of 30 years of this Lukashenko, who's ruled Belarus with an iron fist. And that those times of the Soviet Belarus are over. It's time to move wrong. It's time to move on as countries, not as Soviet republics. Same thing for Ukraine. I think that the Ukrainian fascists, if true, should be under investigated, whether they are influenced by Putin or US interests, or, for the Ukrainian moderates to really right to self-govern without any interference of any foreign power. And what's going on right now in Russia, it's not just some US backed protests. These are literally people in Russia that are opposing Putin's unfair invasion into its western border. And the Russian and Ukrainian diaspora all over the world are also protesting the unnecessary invasion. And I would support those people. And, well, I would agree that, you know, but Putin himself is just another corrupt imperialist, just like the other imperialists in other imperialist nations. Putin has oligarchs who are very, 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 very wealthy, lots of money, who are just as super lavish like these US millionaires and billionaires who are living a good life behind the backs of, its common citizens. And it's still no doubt that Trump has very close connections with these Russian businessmen. So, to end this, I think that, like, this is the bottom line of what being anti-imperialist means for me. And that if we're going to impose anything that's imperialism, this is what opposing imperialism looks like, regardless of any country, whether it's the US, China, or Russia. And even in the EU, with France unnecessary militarization into its former colonies in Africa, or what the UK does complicitly with the US. So, to all my fellow leftists and anti-imperialists out there, just make sure to look in both sides, and just make sure, while you criticize the US, make sure what Russia is doing is not like what the US is doing. Because I criticize both countries, even as anti-imperialist and leftist. So, I'll see you. This is my video of, this is my message to all my fellow anti-imperialists, leftists, and liberals out there who oppose any unnecessary question.